and sharp and eyes glowing red.
Starting off with me going to my dad's house. He lives in a beautiful house with his girlfriend and her 2 kids. Me and her kid are really good friends, but her and her brother are with their dad for a month and a half, so I'll be alone for some time. But my first night here without her, I saw something funny. A shadowy figure in the hallway, downstairs, laying face down. I started to hear scratching, and when I looked down, the figure is gone. So, me being confused, I went back into my room and hid under my covers. I hear someone walking up the stairs towards my room. I'm praying it's not what I think it is. I'm praying it's just my dad checking in on me. Keep in mind, it's 4:28 a.m. The silence is the second loudest thing I can hear. My breathing is the first. Slower and slower footsteps move towards my door. My sister's room is right next to mine. I know it's not my dad anymore, so I'm now hoping it's going to my sister's room. It's not. Under my covers, I try to slow my breathing. It somewhat works. I hear my door crack open. I peek out from the covers. All the lights are on in the hallway and game room. My parents' door is open. I start slowly crying because I thought the shadow did something to them. I see the shadow. It floats into the air. I can feel it breathing above me. I close the little hole that I can see out of, and it starts breathing rapidly. Eventually, the breathing stops and my door closes. I couldn't go back to sleep until 7 a.m. Last night, I got a call from a military buddy that he was looking for a ride home from the bar and didn't want to spend $30 on an Uber ride. I said sure. I was hungover myself and figured it would help to drive with the windows down and get some fresh air. It was probably 12:30 a.m. and I was driving around my neighborhood trying to take an alternate route that I hadn't taken before but knew about. Basically, one that went through residential areas and stayed off of the bigger, more populated routes. I didn't really want to fight traffic the entire way getting downtown. So, as I'm driving, everything was normal. I was listening to some random podcast about World War II. But then, as I'm passing down this one random house a couple of streets down from mine, there's a kid standing in the front yard right on the edge of the road. To be honest, this doesn't really sound that weird. But looking back, it was past midnight and this kid was maybe 10 to 11 years old. He had on a red shirt, tan shorts and sneakers, with a blonde bowl cut. Totally normal looking kid. So, as I'm coming up to this kid, I get to a speed bump and had to slow down, so I was able to get a better look at him. He wasn't playing. He wasn't running around. No other kids were with him. He was just standing completely still and meeting my gaze as I'm going past. Like, the entire way down the street, he doesn't stop staring. And after I'd passed him, I kept looking at my rearview mirror, and he still doesn't stop looking. He doesn't cross the street or go back to playing around. He just keeps standing there, staring at my truck. On the drive back, I told my friend after picking him up about the kid, and he was interested, so I took him back through the same way. The same way where I saw the kid. This time, he wasn't there. Fast forward to when me and my friend get back to my place, sitting in my living room shooting the shit, watching YouTube, and we hear this super fast, quiet knocking at the door. Like, so quiet my AC almost completely smothered the sound. It's about 1:30 a.m. at this point, and both my roommates are out of town for the long weekend, so I was kind of wary of answering the door. I peek out the window next to the front door and see no one there. Honestly, this could have just been a tree limb hitting the roof near the front door, but in that moment, It was like I was having a heart attack thinking that I'd see the kid there. Later, when I was in bed, laying there, I heard a few more random knocks in different places. My bedroom is right next to the front door and goes out onto the patio that the front door connects to. These knocks could have been at the front door or just in some random spots in the house. At this point, I was so tired I really didn't care to worry about it and passed out. Waking up this morning and thinking about those knocks creeped me out a bit more, but just doing a walkthrough of my front patio, nothing was out of the regular, so there's not much else to go on. I know this really isn't the most bone-chilling story, but kinda goes to show how kids can be so creepy with zero effort. My house is very haunted, mostly from my sisters always using our Ouija board. I as well am to blame for some of the paranormal experiences in our lives. I have a few ghost friends of my own. They are around my age, and there are 3 of them: Abigail, Addison, and Grace. Grace is the youngest of them all, and I don't really like her. She has red eyes and continues to knock down my things on my dresser. Abigail and Addison aren't as bad. They just scare me when they show up next to me without announcement, and I don't see them until I turn around. Their dad follows me around. I asked Abigail if she knew, and she said, "You look like his daughter that's still alive." As soon as I heard her say that, I knew he meant me no harm. These 4 ghosts aren't the main part of my story though. There's much more that I will be explaining before the woman on my stairs. I started seeing ghosts at the really young age of 7. Because of how much they scared me, I would have to sleep with my mum almost every night, or at least with someone. At my dad's, I wouldn't have these problems, because anything that spawned in my mum's house stayed in my mum's house. And occasionally, a few days after my grandma had passed away, I would see her smiling at me while I was sleeping. That would scare me, but not as much as it normally would, because I had this feeling she wasn't there to hurt me in any way. Instead, she was there to protect me from the evil that comes into my mum's house. Same thing happened when my great-grandmother had passed away just a few months later of Alzheimer's. Thankfully, it was just a peaceful death while she was sleeping. I never got to meet her, which made me quite sad. My sister's cat had also died a few days before my great-grandma. I still see him walking around our house to this day, and sometimes I still cry about it, because he was such a good boy. But this isn't all the ghosts in my house. My downstairs bathroom right in front of the stairs is a portal between the paranormal and the living. Many demons and angels, even fallen angels, have come through there during the night when it is most active. Sometimes when I'm having sleepovers with my friends, we will go down there and a spirit will push something off the counter, and those things will occasionally break when they get pushed. One of the spirits managed to get out of the portal line and now stays roaming my stairs, making them creak and bang at night. It sometimes even peeks over the ledge at the top to see what me and my friends are doing. This happened in my friend Dustin's house. We were hanging out in his garage. It was myself, Dustin, and 2 of our other closest friends, Brandon and Drew. The 4 of us were all gathered in Dustin's garage, simply hanging out and talking about all matter of high school problems. During the talk, Dustin had made his way to the opposite side of the garage, next to the garage door. The 3 of us hadn't noticed that this was strategic on Dustin's part. See, there was another light switch in the garage, right next to the garage door. Dustin had hatched a scheme to scare us by suddenly turning the lights out in the middle of our conversation. It was near midnight, and we were already wound up. It was guaranteed to leave us in complete darkness. However, this didn't go his way or our way either. None of us knew what was going to happen that night. So Dustin turned out the lights. It startled us at first, but we quickly realized it was Dustin trying to scare us. We asked multiple times for him to turn the lights back on. He responded with poorly acted confusion. He eventually turned them back on for us. The lights in his garage were very bright. We were blinded for a second and had to let our eyes adjust. That's when we saw it. For some strange reason, when the lights came back on, the three of us on the opposite side from Dustin were all facing the same way. We all faced the wall opposite the garage door. It was painted white, so it made this very noticeable to us. We saw a black handprint that was slightly faded. Just this lone handprint. Now, that may seem like it's easily explainable, which it definitely could be. However, what happened next can't be. The three of us mumbled to each other for a second, all asking if we remembered seeing that handprint before the lights went out. We all agreed that we hadn't. Dustin asked what was going on, and we told him we saw a black handprint. He must have thought we were joking because he didn't take us seriously at all. He turned the lights out on us again. This time, we reacted with a little more anger, telling him to turn the lights back on. He tried to joke around with us, but we weren't in a joking mood. He caught the hint and turned the lights back on. When our eyes adjusted to the light again, we saw them. Multiple black handprints, all overlapping each other in a horizontal straight line, leading from one wall to the next. Every wall in the garage now had a line of overlapping black handprints. They were surrounding us. It looked as though something or someone had been running on all fours, horizontally around us, circling us. Dustin saw them as well. The feeling of terror and panic set in for all of us. We trampled over one another, trying to escape the garage. Drew pushed his hands and his head into my back, ramming me through the door into the house. The three of us spilled onto Dustin's living room floor. We couldn't catch our breath and kept shouting nonsense to each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. We all had a hard time calming down. We tried to convince ourselves that it didn't even happen and that we only thought we had seen the handprints. However, when we mustered the courage to go check, we were greeted with the handprints still being there. The garage then became a restricted area for us when we all hung out. The only time we would go back in was to try and do our own investigating. We never cleaned the handprints off. I'm not sure if it was out of fear of angering whatever had left them, or if it was a reminder that it did happen. Either way, it is still one of the craziest experiences I've ever had, and will always stick with me. When my mum was around 15, she had lived in Germany for a few years. Her and her parents rented a 3-story old brick house, though this was a rental house which they were only going to be living in for a small amount of time. One night when my mother went to bed, she tossed and turned, unable to get to sleep for some reason. She didn't know why, but she had a horrible gut feeling. She finally decided to sit up in her bed, knowing that something was definitely wrong, though before she decides to go to her parents' room, she sees a figure standing outside of her window. The outline of a man with the only thing that can be properly made out was the fact that this man had red eyes. My mother wanted to scream for a second, but then something hit her. Her room was on the 3rd floor of the house. There was no way anyone could be standing outside her window, unless they had gotten a ladder and climbed up. But the noise surely would have woken the whole house up. If not, at least she would have noticed. Something in my mother told her not to get up, and just to lay back down and pretend to be asleep, as if she didn't see anything. As much as she wanted to go running to her parents' bedroom, something deep down was sending off alarms, telling her not to. The whole night, my mum laid in her bed unable to get up, but unable to fall asleep due to pure fear overtaking her. She waited until the sun was shining before she looked back over to the window. The man was no longer there. She sighed in relief, though she was still unable to go back to sleep. So she got up and walked to her parents' bedroom, where she woke them both up and told them what happened. My grandfather, her dad, walked to my mum's room, though he didn't really believe my mum, thinking she was just having a bad dream or something. He told her it was nothing, and that no one could have been at her window since they were so far up from the ground. My mum begged my grandparents to believe her, saying she wasn't able to sleep all night nor get up to tell the two of them, though they still didn't believe her. 2 weeks go by, and my mother had only seen the man at her window 5 other times, though she felt like she was being constantly watched in the neighborhood. She kept telling her parents, though, each time they didn't believe her, saying she was just imagining it. Then, when my grandparents were visiting a next-door neighbor, my mother's so-called nightmares were brought up by my grandparents to the lady of the home. The lady went pale as a ghost the moment my grandfather described the man my mother had described to them time and time before in the last week. The lady said it was a spirit that had been around for decades, just standing outside of young girls' rooms, watching them. No one knew why or when the first time the spirit had arrived, but when it did, it never left. Most of the neighbors believed it to be an evil spirit who would prey on the young girls, and once it had its eyes on the next victim, the girl would go crazy, seeing the man everywhere they went in the neighborhood. Though it was just a rumor, this was enough to make my grandparents freak out and move out of the rental as quickly as they could, which, luckily, was extremely quick since they had just moved in and most of the boxes hadn't even been unpacked yet. This had to be one of the more creepy stories my mum had told me. Though many people wouldn't see it as too bad, my mum was terrified, even when telling the story, which she won't do often. You can tell she gets freaked out occasionally. I was reading some true stories on this sub, and I remembered that I never shared this one. It's not super elaborate or flashy, but it actually happened, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. About a decade back, I used to work at a brewery/pub. It was set in a pretty big and old building from the early 1900s. I worked there for a couple of years, and most of the time there, it was pretty chill, but backbreaking at times. On my time working there, I had 2 experiences that I can only describe as supernatural. The first one, it was a particular late night, and I was tasked with closing up the hangar/loading docks. Closing it up was making sure there wasn't anything obstructing where the trucks would park, stacking up any loose crates, turning the lights off and locking it all up. I was about done, so I turned off the lights, and as I'm making my way to the door, a beer bottle comes rolling towards me from the dark between the tall stacks of crates. It wasn't forceful or anything. It looked like someone gently placed it on the floor and rolled it towards me. I didn't think too much of it, so I picked up the bottle and placed it inside a half-empty crate. I turned around, and as I started walking, another bottle comes rolling from the same place. Then another one. Tired and thinking it was a co-worker trying to mess with me, I shout, "Hey, alright, you got me. Come on, I gotta close it up." I was expecting to hear laughter or something, but instead, it was dead silent. I waited for a couple of minutes, turned on my flashlight and started looking around the stacks of crates for what I thought would be a giggling co-worker. After searching each corner in turn, I gave up. I was a little weirded out at this point, but I just picked up the 2 bottles from the ground and placed them in the same crate as the first one. I turned off my flashlight and shouted at the darkness, "Alright, I'm locking up. See you tomorrow." Just as I finished saying that, a crate full of bottles fell from one of the stacks and landed 2 feet from me. Glass shards and beer exploding everywhere. The next day I told my boss about it, and he said it was probably a rat. The thing is, Those crates when full probably weigh 20 pounds. How could a rat push it? Talking to my co-workers, they told me that they've also experienced weird stuff during closing hours. My second experience happened when I was closing the place. This time, I was closing the pub. When closing the pub, the last thing you usually do is restock the walk-in freezer. The freezer is probably just as old as the building itself, and it sits underground, right beneath the bar. I was down there filling that enormous thing with kegs and crates. Being a very old freezer from a time when safety wasn't a big concern, the thing doesn't open from the inside. No handle, nothing. Just a flat, plain steel door. So I did what I always did when I had to go inside the thing. I put a keg securing the door open. I was halfway through the task when I hear the door slamming shut. I rush towards the door, but it's locked shut. I start pounding on it, but the only other person there was my boss in the office, 2 floors above me, probably with his door closed. I tried my phone, but since I'm locked underground inside a steel and lead box, I had no service. I was only wearing jeans and a t-shirt, so things were getting chilly pretty quickly. My face was going numb and my hands were getting stiff. I made a blanket out of cardboard, but it was doing very little keeping the cold at bay. The only reason I didn't freeze to death was because I had a date with a regular and she went there looking for me. She asked my boss where I was, and when he couldn't find me, he went to the basement and found me inside the freezer. I was there for about 45 minutes when he found me, and I was starting to consider writing a letter to my parents and drinking myself to sleep. My boss installed a chain to keep the door open after that, but I refused to walk into that death trap ever again. Weirdest part, the keg I had holding the door open was at the other side of the room when I got out. It was a full steel keg, not something that just slides away, let alone quietly. I stopped working there shortly after, for unrelated reasons. The city had been suffocating me. The constant noise, the never-ending hustle, and the relentless pressure, they were all taking a toll on my mental health. I was just 32, but I felt decades older. So, I decided to escape to a place where silence was the loudest noise, where the pace of life was dictated by the rising and setting of the sun. I found a quaint little Airbnb in the countryside, an idyllic log cabin surrounded by acres of dense woods, far away from the maddening crowd. To be honest, it seemed like a dream, but little did I know, it was a nightmare in disguise. Upon my arrival, the cabin appeared as charming as the pictures. Rustic, isolated and peaceful. But as the sun began to set, the cabin started revealing its true colors. At first, it was the little things, the way the wooden floor creaked under my feet, even when I was standing still. The peculiar smell that lingered in the air, sweet yet metallic. The way the wind howled through the trees, almost like a mournful cry. Then, I started noticing the oddities. The mirrors in the cabin didn't reflect my image correctly. My reflection was always slightly delayed, as if it were another person, mimicking my movements. The paintings on the wall seemed to shift when I looked away, their subjects twisting into grotesque figures. As the night fell, I heard whispers, soft, eerie whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They spoke of sorrow, of loss, and of something darker than I dared not contemplate. Then came the figure. Every night at the stroke of midnight, I could see it in the window. A silhouette standing in the woods, watching. It was always there, unmoving, just watching. Despite the terror that gripped me, I couldn't bring myself to leave. It was as if the cabin had ensnared me in its eerie charm. Every day I would tell myself, oh my god, I'm leaving tomorrow. But when tomorrow came, I found myself drawn further into the mystery of the cabin. What is this place? What secrets does it hold? Why does it not let me go? The questions consumed me, fueling my curiosity and fear in equal measure. But I was determined to uncover the truth or be consumed by it. Days turned into weeks. I found myself weirdly drawn deeper into the hypnotic rhythm of the cabin. The whispers grew louder, the figure in the woods seemed closer, and the cabin's oddities became more pronounced. One day I found a trapdoor under a worn-out rug. It led to a basement I hadn't known existed. The air was damp, filled with the scent of old earth and something else. A smell that made my stomach churn. It was the same sweet yet metallic smell I'd noticed when I first arrived. In the dim light, I could see something etched into the stone walls. Symbols, old and unfamiliar, crisscrossed the surface in a pattern that made my head spin. The same symbols were carved into a wooden pedestal at the center of the room, upon which sat an old leather-bound book. As I approached the book, the whispers grew into a cacophony. I could hear distinct words now, a chant, repeating the same phrase over and over. I couldn't understand it, but I felt a pull, a compulsion to open the book. With trembling hands, I opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, covered in the same symbols from the walls. But there, in the middle of the book, was a picture that made my blood run cold. It was the cabin, and standing by the window was a figure. The same figure I saw every night. But in the book, the figure wasn't outside the cabin. It was inside, staring directly at me. I recoiled in horror, dropping the book. The room plunged into silence. I could feel a presence behind me. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what I knew was there. But I had to. I turned. I turned around and there it was, the figure. It was no longer a silhouette, but a clear, ghastly apparition. It was as if someone had taken a snapshot of despair and molded it into a humanoid shape. It reached out for me with a hand that was both there and not there. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I was a statue, a prisoner of my own fear. The apparition's hand touched my face. It was ice cold, yet it burned. As it did, I felt a wave of emotions flood into me. Sadness, anger, fear, despair. These weren't my emotions. They were its. Suddenly, I was somewhere else. I was still in the cabin, but it was different. Alive, filled with people. I was seeing through someone else's eyes, feeling their emotions, living their memories. I was the apparition. I saw the cabin as it was, not a building, but a prison, a place of punishment for those who dared to challenge the natural order. The apparition, I realized, was not a ghost, but a prisoner, trapped in the cabin for an eternity. The memories became darker, filled with pain and sorrow. I felt every moment of the apparition's loneliness, every second of its despair. It was too much. I screamed, or at least I thought I did. The next thing I knew, I was back in the basement, the apparition gone. I left the cabin the next morning. As I walked away, I could still feel its gaze on me, but it was different. It was no longer a gaze of menace, but of gratitude. I had shared its pain, its solitude. I had given it something it hadn't had in a long time: company. As I left, I glanced back one last time. There in the window stood the figure, watching me leave. But this time, it wasn't alone. Standing next to it was another figure, a familiar one. It was me. I had left the cabin, but part of me would always remain, trapped in the eerie solitude, forever sharing the cabin's haunting secret. Update. I've been back in the city for a few weeks now. The noise, the chaos, it's all the same. But I'm different. The cabin changed me, in ways I'm still trying to understand. Every night I dream of the cabin, of the figure in the window. But it's not a nightmare. It's almost comforting. It's a strange feeling, being connected to something so far away, so different from my own reality.
Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.